My custom Inquisition army has always been intended as a strike force that gets deployed rapidly into some of the Imperium's most horrific battlegrounds. And it feels like it's finally gotten big enough that it needs a ship, fit to carry its soldiers straight into the closest thing this galaxy has to hell. The basis of this conversion was going to be the stormwolf gunship, which I've just found out is tragically discontinued, so it's going to be pretty difficult to make another one of these down the line, so I've got to make this one good. I really like the sort of shipping container thing it's got going on, and the front-facing door, which, though probably horribly impractical, I think looks really cool. The first thing I wanted to modify were these missile pods. I wanted to replace their current boxy shape with a Gothic arch, which would be a really good way to start aligning this model with the rest of the army, since it currently doesn't quite fit in. I cut away the old boxes with my clippers and then cut out 4 small Gothic arch shapes from plasticard, which would form either end of the arched sort of launcher thing. Then I bent a very thin sheet of plasticard over the top and added another thin band of plasticard to form the trim and stuck them in place. They were then cut and sanded so they'd line up with the rest of the angles on the ship and not overlap with the sides. My first attempt at this wasn't great. They looked a little bit like just regular triangles, not arches, and so later on in the project I came back to give this another go, and I think they turned out much better. I think getting a good initial arch shape, having both sides of the covering be a single piece, and also having a bottom piece to secure the sides evenly were the things that made the difference the second time round. Next, I was planning to start working on the sides of the ship. This would have begun with cutting this wolf head detail off, but I actually think there's a lot of really nice potential for a Space Wolf sort of chariot/speeder thing with these bits, so I'm going to save them for another day and make this piece out of plasticard instead. This was actually pretty straightforward because I could just trace the bit and then cut it out. It's flat, so there's nothing really more to it. This made it much more easy to modify the sides, so I decided to cut out another archway. I used the cutout section and bent another thin sheet of plasticard around it in a similar way to what I'd done on the missile pods to make a recess in the side. This is going to house some of the army's relics, and also is kind of reminiscent of the reliquaries the infantry have, just on a larger scale, which is going to serve to better tie this in with the rest of the army. One of the things I think this kit did really well was that in a lot of ways they got in some really subtle wolf head style into the actual ship. You can see it to an extent with the sort of the vent that's going to go up here and the mouth at the front. But the one that's relevant for us right now is that this protrusion at the front is very snout-like. I think it might be one of the things that to try and differentiate it a little bit from the original Space Wolf ship and get it more into our Inquisitorial line, I think I'm going to try and remove this protrusion, which I think could be a little bit tricky because there are a lot of other pieces that line up with it. So this might be where everything goes wrong, but we're just going to have to wait and see. To make these changes, I took the front plasticard panel and cut it so that it would follow the same angle held by the bottom piece. To further change the shape and make the ship even less snout-like, I cut the top part of the panel away to give me a vertical edge. This left me with a front that looked much more heavy-duty than the sharp edge I would have been left with had I stuck with the fully diagonal front. The final big issue with the sides were these doors. They just went in a little too deep for my liking, and I want to use this space for a gun mount. I felt like the sponson guns that came with the kit were just a little bit too bulky, so I filled in the space with some double-layered plasticard. I did quite like the detail on the doors though, so I cut them away first to use in another project. After which, I could glue the walls in place, and the main modifications to the side were complete. These changes had resulted in the ship being a little shorter than it would have been though, so I cut back and sanded the top plate so everything lined up again. The large scale modifications to the ship weren't over yet, but I was a little tired of doing them, so I decided to do a little detail work. Probably come to the point in the project now where I do actually need to deal with the cockpit, and as you may be able to see here, there are a pair of Space Marine legs in the chair, so I'm going to need to cut those out and sculpt in some new ones. I mean, you're barely going to be able to see them, so I'm going to be pretty minimal with it, but they will be legs, and that's all we need. Cutting away the Space Marine legs was actually trickier than I thought it would be, but I did manage to get most of it done without damaging too much of the surrounding areas. I did leave the feet though, since they could be smoothed out and just look like regular boots. I would then need to sculpt a new set of legs, but before that I glued a thin sheet of plasticard to the underside to stop things just falling straight through the gap. I made the new legs using Milliput since I imagined I was going to need to do a bit of sanding and shaping afterwards, which Milliput is much better at than other modelling putties like green stuff. After I blocked out the legs, I compared them to the body I planned to use and realised I had given the pilot comedically wide hips, so I cut back and sanded the legs until our driver was much more reasonably proportioned. I was going to use the torso piece from the Tempestus Aquilon's kit, since the smaller chest plate was in the same style as the Scions I've got for infantry, but a little lighter and so more reasonable for a pilot to be wearing than the full chest plate. I cut the torso piece away from the legs and crotch armor, and then it could simply be stuck on. For the head, I wanted to use this really cool helmet that comes in the Baneblade kit. It is, unusually for this army, skullless, but that's because this guy is a little different to the infantry we've seen up to this point. The helmet prevents him from seeing what the rest of the army is actually fighting, so for the SCP fans out there, they're kinda like scramble goggles. You'll hear a little bit more about the lore of this thing in the next video where I paint it all up. But the problem I have right now is that he has no neck. For this I'm going to turn to my old reliable green stuff. Oh, I think mine might have gone off. I used brown stuff to fill out the neck and let me stick the head in place. This was actually my first time using brown stuff. I'd never used it before this project, so I'll talk a little bit later on about my experience with it. The final part of the pilot I had to add were his arms, which I used the gunner arms from the Cadian heavy weapon team for, after which he could be glued in place. I then turned to the missile pods, since it was finally time to actually add the missiles in. One thing that had been bugging me was the way the missile pods sat slightly higher than the rest of the top of the ship, so I cut out the bottom plate and stuck a piece of plasticard onto the underside to make them sit flush. Then all I needed to do was get the missiles in. This was done by cutting away the missile tips from their backing and then just gluing them in place. And with that, we have finally completed step 1 of the instruction manual. Then it was time to go back to using plasticard to fill in the big gaps we still had all over the model. This involved capping off the sides so that there'd be no gap between them and the top plate, and then cutting out a sheet of plasticard to fill the gap where the sort of snouty vent I mentioned earlier would normally sit. I then turned back to the side doors I'd filled in earlier. This is where I wanted to add some sort of sponson guns. I chose to use heavy bolters since I plan to run the ship as a Valkyrie in game, and those are part of the Valkyrie's loadout. I'd originally planned to use these heavy bolters from the heavy weapon team's kit, but the ones that I had left over from the Penitent Engine kitbash I did last year worked out much better, since they were mirrored, meaning that they could both have the shell ejection port facing outwards. They would still need some lengthening though. I did this by separating the front and back section of the gun, and then gluing in a styrene rod, which I then covered with brown stuff. I had mixed up a little bit too much though, so I used the spare bits to fill in some of the Norse rune details that were spread across the model, and then gave the saw some time to cure. And while I did, I turned my attention back to the top part of the ship. On this middle section here, I want to recreate one of those sort of knight tomb things that you see in churches. And I'm just going to use as a stand-in for now this old Scion chest piece. This thing is going to be the previous pilot's dead body. You know, once they've died in battle, what's going to happen is they get put in and a lot of wires get added on and they become kind of like a servo skull. I've been reading a bit of the wiki about servo skulls and I think this should work, but the details might be a little bit wrong, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, this dead guy's been chosen to go on serving in death. The idea is this old pilot's going to have loads of different wires and cables running into them, and this guy is actually going to be the thing that's controlling the sort of automated guns on the side. I don't know, we'll figure it out. I marked out and then cut out yet another Gothic arch, which really was beginning to be a bit of a pain. You know, I'm doing so many of these at this point, I really should just find an easier way to do it. I then used the exact same method as I had on the other side niches to create a recess, the only difference being that I'd cut some corner sections of plasticard to keep the base and front of the wall at right angles. To make our skeletal scion, I was going to need to use another discontinued unit, the old skeleton warrior kit. But since I'd had to get them pre-built, I was going to have to cut them up a bit. So this little ribcage that came just bare is fine. There's nothing I need to do to that. I've chosen this guy because this chest plate has been stuck on afterwards, and it, you might be able to tell, hasn't been stuck on incredibly well, which is very good for me because I think I might be able to pull it off and have a nice texture-free ribcage inside, but we'll have to see. And these are the legs that I'm going to need for the entombed guy on top. So I took the parts I needed, after which I could stick the rib cages and skulls into the side niches we made earlier. These guys aren't controlling any guns like the top guy, but they are still honoured ancestors. The guy on top was going to need a little bit more modification though, so I took the boots and the knee pads from the Tempest's Aquilon that I used earlier, and then glued them onto the skeleton's legs. These could then be glued into the chest plate, and the skeleton's neck into the top. For that classic Knight's Tomb look, I also wanted to give this guy a sword laying on his chest. I'd saved up this sword from my Alpha Legion video last year since it had a little Inquisition logo on the guard, and this seemed like a great place to use it. I stuck the skeleton arms onto the torso and bent them into position over the chest, ready to hold the hilt. So I wasn't quite sure what I was going to give our dead guy over here. I considered this gun, which I made up of the regular gun and the spare pieces one, because the sword is ever so slightly too long. But I think the problem with the gun is it just covers up a little bit too much of the skeletonness of this guy. So instead, I am going to try and use this sword. But I'm going to cut it down. And I worry that that might be quite difficult. To shorten the sword, I cut a section out of the middle and then glued the two halves back together, after which I cut out the handle so that it could be stuck into the skeleton's hands. I was just about to stick the sword on, and he stands up. I didn't think he'd be able to do this. Diabolical. With the sword finally in position, I added the skull, which would finish off our dead guy. With all that done, the brown stuff on the side guns had finished curing, and I could get back to those. I cut the messy middle section down until it was square and would sit well in the mounts that I had planned. So to keep these guns in place on the side, I want to give them something that lets them sort of pivot. Maybe not actually, but in theory it makes it look like they could point around the place. And one of the things that seemed pretty perfect for that was this mount, which, you know, will sit over this bit and, you know, let it twizzle around as it likes. The thing is, this is a searchlight holder from the Horus Heresy spacemarine vehicle kit. I didn't actually have this, and the cheapest way I could acquire these searchlights was in a pack of like 20 of them. I don't even know how many this is, but this is a ridiculous number of searchlights. The searchlight holders were a little bit big though, so I cut them down until they held the guns a little bit better and used a circle tool to cut out a circle of plasticard and make it look a little bit more like the guns could actually swivel up and down. After which, the mounts were glued in place and the guns could be glued into position. I did have to use super glue on the brown stuff since plastic cement won't work on modelling putties like this. I used the ammo belts from the mortifier kit to tie the guns into the model a little better. And then I added some green stuff worms, which are actually leftovers from the Imperial gargoyles. I'm really cleaning up quite a lot of spurs with this build now I think about it. The cables do a really good job of summing up the differences I experienced between green stuff and brown stuff, since I'd also made short lengths of brown stuff cable, but these snap when bent, whereas green stuff ones are still flexible a year later. Brown stuff's harder and will hold sharp edges better, but it is more brittle. Started work on so many random individual pieces. I think at this point it is actually time for us to now start sticking things together properly. This is when things really began to come together and I could finally begin to properly see how this ship was going to turn out. There are a few small changes I made here from the instructions, using parts from the two build variants to get something I preferred the look of, and also removing the front mini wings since I didn't really like how they looked. Probably the biggest change I made was sticking the thrusters on upside down and using the diagonal underside of the wing supports to give a cool down-angled wing, which I think is way cooler. I still had one more gun that I wanted to add, since the only section of the Valkyrie loadout that was missing was a multi-laser. For this, I used yet another spare from a previous project, this time the multi-laser from the Horus Heresy Basilisk. I cut down the barrel and stuck it to the front of the ship on a little piece of plasticard for some separation. I think having this placed to one side gives the model some nice asymmetry, which I think it really lacked before. When it came to gluing in the skeleton dude, he was going to need a little bit of bedding in to look natural. So I used more lengths of green stuff cable to make it look like he was properly hooked up into the ship. Now we really were on the home stretch. All that was left to do now was add the remaining sections of trim, fill the big gaps, and steel rivets from every spare piece I could find to blend in the added details. I added some little candles made from fishing wire and brown stuff to the reliquies, and finally a searchlight on top. So let's have a look at how this all turned out. I've got to say, I'm really happy with this. It's still obvious what this ship is made from, but it's different enough that it can fit really nicely into the rest of my army and not look too much like a Space Wolves ship. As you may notice, it's not painted or based or anything, and I'll tackle that in next month's video, along with the lore of this thing, which I hope I've given you enough of a taste of to pique your interest. It's going to be the biggest lore update for this army since I started it, so if that's your thing, definitely come back and check it out. I've got a lot more stuff on the way, so you can expect monthly videos for a little while, and as always, if you have any ideas of cool conversions to add to this army or any of the other stuff I work on, then please do let me know. But until next time, thanks for watching, and bye for now.